Sorry, I'll sit right back here. Okay, if I could, can that go down just a fraction, please? Thanks, sorry, Kevin, I'll just kick off, but if you could do that for me, that'd be great. Although I know I had no voice last time, maybe that's what it still turned up from. Oh, hang on, there's a volume on here. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, no. If I could just begin with the statement of acknowledgement. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we are meeting, and we pay our respects to their elders and to elders from other communities who may be here today. Welcome all to this special meeting on the 15th of June. We do have a quorum still waiting on Councillor Quilty. Item 3 is apologies and requests for leave of absence. We have 2 apologies this afternoon. One is Councillor Watson and the other is Councillor Hall. Item 4, declarations under Acts, regulations, codes or local laws.
Madam Mayor, councillors, members of the audience are reminded that audio, video and still imaging equipment is not allowed to be used unless prior consent has been obtained from the chair.
Item 5 is declarations by councillors of any conflict of interest. Councillors, do we know if we have any? Thank you. Item 6 is the request to be heard by Mike Fraser for the draft budget 18-19. Councillors, I'm just going to remind you that today's special meeting is about hearing Mr Fraser present his submission. Only questions for clarification are to be sought. There is to be no debate and discussion, just to remind us, as per the 223 process. Correct. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. First, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you and for taking the time out to give me this chance. I guess my submission is really based on 2 concerns that I've got. I'm actually concerned that the discussions that are going around the community about and the anxiousness of cost cutting with that it's perceived to be required, when I'll go into it further, that I don't believe it will be, cost cutting of council services. And also, I guess I've heard in recent times, or in the last month or so, even at the last council meeting, I've heard 4 councils state that they want their waste levy budget, they would like to have it fixed in this year as part of this budget. And that's part of the primary reason why I think I'd like to highlight what I believe are some opportunities. I've prepared a presentation. Unfortunately, the technology in our new council chambers is probably limiting that, so I'll work our way through that. The second page of the presentation it's just a copy of all of the forms that I'm sure, as 4 years as councillor, I was damn sick of looking at as part of 4 budget processes. To be honest, you go through the detail, and I've heard it said in the last 2 years again, we go through it all, business unit by business unit, line by line. And to be honest, I don't think you can look at it till you're blue in the face. They don't tell you too much or provide much data. Next page. They actually roll up into the P&L, which is the real budget document. And then if we quickly turn to the next page, I want to focus on 2 areas. I think you've got that highlighted: employee costs and material expenses in the budget. And because I like pictures as well, I've actually put some 2 charts there. And if you look at the charts, it's just comparing this year's forecast year end compared to the budget. And it actually looks pretty good, so you can see why everybody based on that would be reasonably comfortable with what the budget says. It actually says there is a decrease in this year's budget on total employee costs. I'd like to spend a little bit more detail, what some have said, unpacking and looking at the detail in that. Moving on, I guess that raises the question that I'd like to raise is, and I'm now told Principal Skinner as an assistant in this, how much confidence should we have in that year-end forecast? Especially, and I'd like to highlight the fact if we look at the April year-to-date finance report, we are $1 million favourable to that report, or to budget, year-to-date in employee costs, and $2.3 million favourable to budget in expense materials. the question then comes, how much confidence should I have in the year-end forecast? To try and give me a feel for it, again, trying to turn some stuff into pictures, looking at the material costs. And I've included this chart in the submission, the actual submission, where we look at the blue line there is actually material cost spend by month, year to date for the up to April, and the blue line rising in that sudden step increase is what the forecast needs to be in order to achieve the year-end forecast. The bars below that chart actually show you for the last 4 years what the actual expense reported for the last in each of the last 4 years. So the question I've got is moving on to the next slide. There is quite a difference between what needs to be spent year to date compared to what has historically been spent both this year and every year for the last 5. That gap, and again, if you look at the picture there, that box, if you like, shaded box, adds up to about $2 million. Stepping away from that now, moving into the next chart, I then go and look at that couple of comparisons, painting pictures to see if I can get a better feel for what's happened. The first bar on that chart is the 17-18 forecast, the base that's been set for this operating plan. I'll skip the green one for now. The next line on that is actually the 18-19 SRP level. This is what this council set as what would be the expense spend 12 months ago as part of the last budget process in the last 10-year plan. The final column on the right is what the draft budget says. So again, looking at material expense compared to this year's forecast, the budget expense and the forecast for this year is actually going to decrease. The green line is what would happen, or what the 17-18 expense, or the green bar is the 17-18 expense if that $2 million gap is not realised or isn't spent. So that's a forecast that I've done based on that gap not being achieved. So we get a different picture here. Instead of having a decrease in material expenses, we actually end up with a significant increase. So we go from what I think will be some close to $19 million to a budget now of over 20 million, 21.5 million. Go to the next page. Which forecast should I believe? Who's right? And the truth is, the real truth is, the answer is probably somewhere in between. But while I'm not a person that who spends a lot of time looking back, move on, you've got to move on, we've got to all move forward. I also believe that history can teach us a lot, and we can learn a lot from it. So what I've done, if you go to the next page, I've gone and got from our statutory accounts. So, and I say our because it's Wodonga Council statutory accounts. This is the maintenance, this is the material expense for the last 4 years. There is a glitch there in 15-16. I should add for Narelle's, for clarity, I've actually adjusted taken 3.2, 3.5 million off those historical numbers for the last 2 years to allow for what the capitalisation or capital project adjustment in year end. Narelle will know Officer Klein will know what I'm talking about. And I've allowed for the 13, 14, 14, 15, I've estimated that to be about $2.5 million. So the picture we get then is that the budget actually has a significant increase in material expense based on a forecast for this year that I think is probably inflated, well, more than likely inflated. Next slide, I've actually stolen a quote from someone sitting in front of us. He knows who it is. I won't say any more. We'll move on to the next slide. Or the next picture. We don't have slides. So again, this chart is what I've included in the submission, is a summary. What I've tried to do here in taking the time that you've made available for me is to explain how that's come about and to give some background. So we have a budget that actually looks, a draft budget that actually appears to have a reduction in spend. When if you realistically look at, realistically take an approach on the underlying expenses and also compare that to historical costs, that is actually an increase, and what I would call a significant increase, which to me needs to be understood. The next slides look at, and that was looking at material expense. I think there's an opportunity in there. The next slide looks, the next couple of slides or the next couple of pictures actually then starts to look at employee costs. And the employee cost picture is a lot less, and probably what I will call the gap is a lot smaller. The principle still exists. Similar sort of thing. Moving through a couple of slides to what I've put, the slide I've put, or the chart I've put in the submission, looking at historical costs, and these are historical costs for the last 5 or 6 years, which actually shows the good job the council has done in maintaining and holding council costs, or holding employee costs, as was reflected last Tuesday night, or Tuesday this week, at the Ratepayers Association, where headcount has been held constant for the last 5 or 6 years. However, if we look at where the year end may well finish, and I'll say may, what looks like a small increase is actually a larger increase. What does this all mean? I believe that the 17-18 year-end forecast for material costs and employee costs are overstated. So the budget base is overstated. I would estimate that that number is somewhere between $1 and $3 million. Because this sets the base for the 18-9 budget, and I'll argue that they're the only numbers you've seen to compare against is a year 17-18 forecast. It inflates what could and should be the 18-19 forecasts. It is my submission to you that these funds could and should be available to rebalance the waste, or the waste levy excess. And I call it an excess, not overcharge, through larger reductions in the waste levy charge. I'll also there, my calculations, every $1 million would actually mean based on just under 18,000 residents who are paying the waste levy charge, that every $1 million would be a $55 reduction in their charges. I would also argue, based on this, that it can be done now. It doesn't have to wait another 12 months or for another budget process, and without the reduction, and it can be done without a reduction in total spend year on year to what will be achieved, and without to the communities, hopefully the communities' relief, without reduction to cost to any council services. One of the questions will come out of that is, you've got a staff or a council-driven forecast versus a Mike Fraser one, if you like. Which one's going to be closest? As I said earlier, the truth is probably somewhere in between. And one of my old bosses used to tell me the only forecast that you can rely on is an actual. There's no such thing as a good forecast. The only thing you can do, what you've got to do is wait. I guess there's a few dates coming up that might help us give us an idea. On Monday, in your next council briefing, I am running on the assumption that you'll see the cut of the end of May financials after another month. So you'll have a better idea of whether what's still left to be spent year to date. On the 25th, those same numbers will be presented at the council meeting, so they'll be available publicly, and out of interest, I'll be here to have a look and see what there is. I guess then on the next dates, we have the next sense check dates available. There will be the SIC meeting in July when the first cut of the financials are. They are, and they will be preliminary. They'll still give us a very good idea. And then September, I'm not sure whether it'll be the September or the October council meeting, where I expect that we'll see my expectation is, and history in the last 12 years will tell us that this won't change, that you will be presented with a significant surplus out of the 17-18 year, for which counts surplus of funds that are available because that forecast was not spent, was not delivered, was not achieved. I guess my plea to you, to councillors, to all 7 councillors, is then to give consideration to what real impact should that have on the 18-19 and the next draft budget. That's all for me, and I thank you for your time.
Do you have any clarifying questions that you would like to ask? I'll go to councillors first, and then I'll come to you, Officer Klein. Councillors, you're good? Councillor Mildred? No? Yep.
Sorry that I was late. I got detained when the rain was buckling down. I went back for an umbrella, so I was a few minutes late. So my understanding of what you're saying here is that we've had this rolling surplus every year, this over budget, which gets rolled over into the budget next year, and that's been going on and snowballing gradually bigger as budgets increase every year. Would that be accurate?
I think what you're seeing is some of that, yes.
Yeah.
The fact that the 17-18 forecast includes about $1.7 million of carry over from the last year, on top of what was set as the base.
No, look, I will wait, sorry. I have a question that might be linked, Councillor, and please you tell me if it's not a clarification. I guess it's clarifying. Do you consider that there are any other reasons for a forecast not being achieved other than just surplus?
No. I think that it is not a case of the surplus. The 17-18 forecast should be a forecast of what the organisation believes it will spend this year or spend in the current year. If it is not, if it is an accumulation of funds that have been allocated, and I'll use the word allocated, for future projects that won't be delivered in this year or won't be delivered in the year, that still inflates a forecast, inflates the base for which councillors are making a judgment on what is required to provide council services for the following 12 months.
All right, so I guess if there is this rolling surplus, it presents potentially a one-off opportunity to bring it back. So even though it's been rolling on year for year, every year, if you cut it down this year, then it will stop it going forward. So there's a one-off opportunity to rein the budget in by 1 to 3 million now. Would that be accurate?
My response to that is, I think focusing on a surplus is a little confusing. I'll use the word misleading. I think what should be focused on is when you are when councillors are sitting down to determine what is required to support the service, what is needed in the next financial year, it needs to be based on a forecast of what has been spent or what needs to be spent this year to provide those services. I'll go back. And that's why I've added the historic costs, looking at previous years, because this is what this council has told the state government it has spent to provide all of the services that it is providing, and this is what has been required to actually deliver those services. Yeah.
So I understand what you're saying, but my understanding, and then I'm asking a clarify because I want to make sure that we're coming from the same direction, that, and let you use your examples, materials, is actually not costed just on, well, that's what we spent the year before, therefore this is what we'll spend this year. It's actually based on forecasting costs of all the projects that sit there that says that it's going to cost us $1 million to build that bit of road, and it's going to cost us $500,000 to do that park, and it's going to cost us that. And actually that's how the materials costs are made up, not like, oh, we spent $1 million net last year, we'll add 10% and put in $1,100,000, because that's not my understanding of how our numbers are calculated. So I'm interested in your thoughts.
I'd like to think that's the case too. I guess the only way to test that is to actually say, do you understand what the increases are? Because I'll go back, when council laws, and speaking as an old councillor, is presented with a book that thick that only has the only thing you can work out whether is this an increase on this year or last year is using a forecast that includes a carryover, was probably inflated. I guess, and I'm happy to offer my services to help resource this. What I'd be looking, and history has told me, or learning has told me, what I'd like to see is not the forecast of what's to be spent, where I'm saying I don't think you'll spend that, because so therefore the real cost of providing the services, those services, are not being reflected in that forecast. And then you're trying to compare, because as a councillor, when you get those documents, you just look for the big changes and then ask for the questions about what's changed, what's not. Now, I'm sure that there is diligence, and as the CEO has gone through last Tuesday night with the Ratepayers Association, that it's real bottom up. But I guess the thing I'm saying is, in 6 weeks' time, when councillors sit there and are told or see that that's not the cost that was that's not the cost base required to provide the services that we need, how does that impact what we think we need for next year? I'm not sure that I've answered your question, Madam Mayor.
So what you seem to be suggesting is that if the number doesn't come out to what's been forecast or budgeted, we've got it wrong, versus potentially we make the CEO and her team absolutely work as hard as they possibly can to bring everything in under what we have costed at the best cost. And let's use our LED lights, for example, where we budgeted $1 million that came in at about 700 and something because we got extra buying power. That's a great result for our community. So I'm hearing your viewpoint, but what it seems to be coming from is a position of, well, those figures are going to be wrong, versus a position of we should be trying to do better than what we actually put into our budget every single year for eternity.
It's a technicality. What you're picking is capital projects. I'm sure the principle is the same for expense. But if it's the discussion, I guess my point on that is, if that is the case, and it's only instead of $1 million to provide these services, it's only cost us $700,000. But we have based the forecast for what we need next year on the $1 million.
So I can confirm that we've had a couple of changes made in the budget process in the last couple of years, and one of those processes that we changed is certainly back at executive review time of budgets. We actually have introduced the actuals for the prior year and a variance to the proposed budget against those actuals, as well as the current year's adopted budget and the current year's forecast. So we've actually generated a number of savings, particularly in the 17-18 budget as a result of doing that process, and that's continued on in this year as well. Not reflected in the operating budget by business unit document that went out to the public, but it's certainly included in the documents that we've used internally in preparing those budget numbers. I did have a clarifying question I wanted to ask, just to assist the councillors. When you've put your numbers together, particularly in relation to materials, have you taken into account that we don't accrue our expenses throughout the year, so that if you're just picking up the expenses from the monthly finance reports, you'll be missing a month's worth of expenditure?
We're verging on debate here, but I'll respond to that by saying I've based that forecast my forecast, if you like, of the year to go is based on the average of the year to date plus 30%. So knowing that we spend more, plus 30%. Now, I'll also point out, and this is where we're getting into debate, but I won't apologise because the question's been asked. If that is the case, then I would expect to see almost zero costs, zero expenses in July, because you don't accrue them. You don't receive any invoices. And if you go back and look at the chart, and I'm not sure which page it'll be on yours, this one here, there is actually it doesn't appear that July is any different to any other month. But based on your discussion of not accruing, then there shouldn't be any invoices, so we haven't any costs. So there's an inconsistency in there.
Just on the wages one as well, that there's wage accruals. So for this year in particular, there's 2 weeks' worth of wages that will be accrued at the end of the year that won't have been taken into account in coming up with these numbers. Yeah.
Okay, Councillor Quilty, did you have any other clarifying questions, please? No. Councillor Bennett? No. Thank you very much for your submission, Mike. And that just leaves me, councillors will clearly take this and have another good look, and also have some further questions answered as to numbers. Sorry, what do I need to do? Anything? Just close the meeting? So I need to have it moved and second to accept the submission? Councillors, can I have somebody? Thank you, Councillor Bennett. Thank you, Councillor Quilty. Is there any comment? Councillor Quilty?
Just briefly, in general, I'm supportive of former Councillor Fraser's position. I've tried to, in some way, pick up and carry his banner since he was not elected and I was, whichever inadequately I may have done that, as may have been pointed out by the quote he had in the document. So I certainly thank him for that, and I do, in principle, agree with most of what he said today.
Briefly, thank you again, Mike, for putting in time, energy and effort. The budget, as you would understand, is a large document and does take time to go through. Councillor Quilty, I look forward to seeing some of that work that you've done then to then have further discussions with your fellow councillors. And Mike, as always, your interest is appreciated, and also your commitment to our community. So thank you. Back to you, Councillor Bennett, for close. No, councillors, all those in favour? Thank you. Motion is carried. That just leaves me to close the meeting and look forward to seeing you on the 25th of the month when we do have the final budget, in front of us. So thank you very much. Thank you, councillors. Councillors, we will be staying